gory interior of the most remote parts of the Elks, if you haven't been there yourselves. And I'll show you some San Juan Mountains too, if we have time tonight, with beautiful music behind it. But first, the evolution of the project was kind of interesting. As of March 15th, I had no idea I'd be doing this project, which is kind of late in the game, considering it takes a lot of time to design, edit, proofread, and get a book printed and shipped from Hong Kong over to Colorado to put into the bookstores. So I was in Steamboat Springs on March 15th. I just finished teaching a winter photography workshop and got the word on my phone that Governor Polis had just shut down ski season. And I was wondering what I was going to do for the next couple of months other than backcountry skiing. And the next morning, I got an email from this woman, Jeri Norgren, who I did not know. And she proposed that that I consider, or at least give her advice about a book that she had conceived over 3 years since it hadn't been done before, apparently. And that is, how did all the 58, not 54, 58 is the Colorado Geological Survey's quantity of 58 of 14ers, and how not only did they get named, but who were the first folks to climb them. And at first, to me, it sounded like a really good $15 scholarly textbook. And she told me about historical sketches that the artist of the Hayden survey and other surveys from the late 1860s and 1870s, both in Colorado and around the West, had made, and that they might be good black and white decoration for the book. And I said, yeah, that's a great idea. Let me know, keep me posted on your progress. So I really wasn't interested in publication. So that was a Monday, and Monday night I had a really bad night sleeping and woke up the next morning having dreamed that maybe there was a Fielder style coffee table book in this, that having over 40 years carried 65 pounds of large format camera equipment to pretty much every single alpine drainage, cirque, glacial cirque with 13 and 14,000 foot peaks all around, and those beautiful tarns or alpine lakes reflecting the peaks in the background, including in the Elk Mountains. And I was thinking, I probably have 14ers in most of those photos, even though, I never really set out to photograph all the 14ers, and I never set out to climb all the 14ers. So for the next 2 weeks, I went through 20,000 4x5 transparencies that I have right over here in various filing cabinets, pulling out each transparency in a sleeve and looking at it and trying to figure out if there was a 14er reflecting in that lake or in the background of the image. And it took me 2 weeks. And after 2 weeks of basically reviewing my my life, came up with about 60% of the 58 14ers. And then I thought to myself, we could fill in the rest of them with some of those sketches. But then I remembered a man named Robert Wogren, who had contacted me back in the 80s and the 90s. And he was originally an architectural painter. So in the day before computers, if you were an architect and you needed a rendering of your building design, you hired somebody like Bob to do it. But he got tired of that, and in the 80s and 90s set out on a project to hike to at least the base of all the 14ers and to sketch them with a pen and a pencil, and then go home and do oil paintings. And he contacted me in the early 1990s about perhaps publishing a calendar of his paintings, and I declined because I just didn't have enough space on the publishing schedule in those days. But I remembered him and I contacted him in Lakewood, and he is now 94 years old. He was 93 earlier this year when I contacted him, and in good shape physically and mentally. And yes, he would be interested in lending his oil paintings that I didn't have in photos to the project, to the book, as well as his pencil and pen sketches. So now I got to 56 of the 58 peaks. I needed two more, Cameron and Culebra and the Sangre de Cristos. And I called my friend and ski buddy, John Kiedrowski, a mountain climber from Vail, Colorado. And John had done a book called Sleeping on the Summits, where he climbed all the 14ers and took pictures at sunrise and sunset and made a book of that. And sure enough, John had Cameron and Culebra, and that completed the project, at least in terms of the artwork. And then I hired my designer, Rebecca Finkel, and editor and proofreader. And for the next 3 months, basically April, May, June, Jeri and I put a fairly complex book together, faster than I've ever put a book together before, shipped it off to the printer, and got the books in the stores in early September. So fascinating logistical process, and of course, an incredible book. Jeri's written 70,000 words, a lot of journal stories from surveyors of the Hayden Survey and the Wheeler Survey about what life was like in the 1860s and 70s, climbing and exploring the same peaks and places that we do with Gore-Tex today without Gore-Tex back then, which made it not dissimilar, but a little bit tougher. So that's the evolution of the project. A little bit about the Hayden Survey. You know, there were several surveys, Powell, Wheeler, but Hayden's was the one that was the most accurate, most comprehensive, not only in Colorado, but around the West, for mapping the West, where the mountains were, where the drainages, rivers were geologically mapped, and the heights of the peaks were calculated. And that required climbing to the top of, if not 14,000 foot mountains, nearby 13,000 foot mountains, to be able to see and triangulate and use the theodolite to be able to engineer the mapping. So that was a big source for us artistically and from a content standpoint. So with that said, I'm gonna share my screen with you all, and we'll get started with the show. That's the book, front and back cover. I'm gonna go right away to what we're gonna do first is talk about your backyard. Those of you in Pitkin County listening and watching tonight. That is one of the sketches done by the primary artist of the Hayden Survey, William Henry Holmes, and he made that sketch east of Snowmass Mountain. You can see Snowmass Lake in the bottom right of those peaks. 1873, he did that standing, I think he was near Coffee Pot Pass, you know, Conundrum Pass, the pass that separates Gothic from Conundrum Hot Springs and that drainage, looking to the kind of west northwest. And my my exploration of the Elks has been pretty extensive. I mean, I've pretty much been everywhere. And my first explorations were back in the late 70s into the 80s, but I did a book, maybe some of you have this, there's still a few copies available if you Google it, called To Walk in Wilderness, with the writer Tom Barron and his friend Pete Stouffer from Aspen. The three of us spent 30 straight days in the wilderness with 3 llamas carrying most of the gear. And we went up every drainage. I photographed every lake, and where we didn't have llama access, we just hoofed it on foot with all of our gear. And that book that you see on the left there was published in 1993. And then the other project that got me back into the wilderness was this book, the Big Brown Book, Colorado 1870 to 2000, that many of you may have on your coffee tables. If not, it's still available online. You can go to Amazon and get a copy there. And that was the project where I did repeat photography of the official photographer of the Hayden survey, William Henry Jackson, who was on the survey from 1870 to 1878 with the troops. And I ended up doing a project that resulted in 3 books where I found 300 locations, including on the top of 14ers that Jackson stood to make his images. And I found the same place and pointed the camera in the same direction, framed it the same way, and showed how places had changed a little, for the better, for the worst, over up to 138 years of time. And you'll see in a little while some of those repeat photos from the Elk Mountains. So I'm gonna hand it over to Jeri right now. She's gonna tell a story or two about the Bells, Maroon Peak and North Maroon Peak. By the way, that's Maroon Lake in mid-December. I don't know if you'll believe this, but I have never in my life stood on the edge of Maroon Lake in the summer or fall with the 300 other people who take that picture, because 40 years ago when I started my career, I said to myself, the one thing I'm not going to do is photograph next to other people, and I'm going to go find places that nobody else has ever found and photographed. And I've stuck to that rule. I'll tell you the story in a little bit of why I was there at that location, the only time in my life. But I've been every other place and past that location on the trailhead for sure, going to Buckskin Pass. So Jeri, take it away.
Thanks, John. As John said, I'm going to talk about Maroon Peak and North Maroon Peak. These 2 peaks are Colorado's most photographed and easily recognized mountain couple. They resemble 2 bells caught in the act of ringing and are fondly referred to as the Maroon Bells. While in the Elk Mountains during the summers of 1873 and 74, no one from either the Hayden or Wheeler surveys ascended the peaks, although topographer Henry Gannett and photographer William Henry Jackson did explore much of the area surrounding the peaks. Gannett describes his reasons for the name and for not attempting an ascent. This peak is so named from its peculiar color, that of the sandstones of which it is composed. It is one of the highest peaks in the system, and its summit is nearly, if not quite, inaccessible. The summits were considered by the men to be one, and the whole thing was just called Maroon Mountain. In Wheeler's report, assistant geologist John J. Stevenson eloquently describes the peaks and offers a different name. The crest of this exceedingly narrow ridge resembles a line of ancient castles. Indeed, standing in any of the enormous cavities under this ridge, from which issue many of the streams which form the Roaring Fork, one needs little power of imagination to conceive himself within the ruins of some majestic cathedral, whose towers surmounting the massive walls still remain to attest its pristine splendor. 2 of the peaks rise to almost 14,000 feet. One of these I had the honor to dedicate, with the consent to my associates, to Mr. R.P. Whitfield, the distinguished paleontologist of Albany, New York. It is pyramidal in shape, composed of sedimentary rocks, varying in color from dark gray to dull red and maroon, and almost horizontal along the face, so that taken in connection with its surroundings, it is probably the weirdest object in this portion of the chain. Since Hayden's survey reports were widely considered more thorough than Wheeler's, it stands to reason that Stevenson's name of Whitfield for the peak did not endure, and along the way, Maroon Mountain was changed to Maroon Peak, and the peak to the north, which was once considered only a prominent shoulder, was recognized as North Maroon Peak. The first ascent of Maroon Peak may have been in the 1890s by a young man from Crested Butte, although evidence is only in the form of a letter written some years later. In 1925, C.P. Wilson wrote to John L. Jerome Hart and talked about his time in Crested Butte. Having spent most of the earlier years of my life at Crested Butte, such names as Maroon, SNOWMASS, and Castle are entirely familiar, and I have been to the top of all of them. A sense which were apparently simple and easy 30 years ago to a boy of 18 would, I am afraid, present an entirely different problem now. Wilson's story notwithstanding, the first recorded summit of North Maroon Peak occurred on August 25th, 1908 by Percy Hagerman and Harold Clark via the North Face, a route still considered dangerous and demanding. 3 days later, Hagerman summited Maroon Peak alone up the southwest face, making the first official ascent of that mountain. By the end of August, Hagerman and Clark between them had recorded a total of 4 first ascents in the Elk Mountains: Maroon Peak, North Maroon Peak, Capitol Peak, and Pyramid Peak. Clark and Hagerman met in Aspen on one of Hagerman's visits to see his father. Clark was one of the new breed of amateur mountaineer, and Hagerman referred to himself as one of the first Colorado men to climb extensively just for the sake of climbing. Hagerman was an active member in the Colorado Mountain Club from its beginnings in 1912. In his first year of membership, club president James Grafton Rogers asked him to write a detailed account of his many climbs in the Elk Mountains. The resulting Notes on Mountaineering in the Elk Mountains of Colorado, 1908 to 1910, as well as Hayden's 1877 Geological and Geographical Atlas of Colorado, were for many years the only guides available to those wishing to climb in the Elk Mountains. In their summers of mountaineering discoveries in the Elks, both Hagerman and Clark became the unrivaled authorities on the majority of the peaks. Not only did they claim first ascents on 414ers and numerous non-14ers, but they also pioneered many of the climbing routes still in use today. There are 2 peaks in the Elks which memorialize the 2 climbers. Clark proposed Hagerman's name for a 13,841-foot graceful and extremely sharp southwest ridge of a summit southeast of SNOWMASS Mountain. In return, Hagerman proposed a peak to be named in honor of Clark, a lofty 13,560-foot summit east of Capitol Peak. Given that this climbing duo summited all the major peaks in the Elk Mountains, it is fitting that their names remain as a reminder of their many accomplishments.
Thank you, Jeri. Is that your complete Maroon Bells and Conundrum Castle Peak?
That's just Maroon Bells.
Was that just Maroon? Okay.
Yeah.
I'll show a couple of other photos real quick and tell you a little bit about Conundrum and Castle too. And then Jeri, do you want to do Castle and Conundrum after that?
Uh-huh.
So this color photo that you see is made at the same time as the black and white. This was mid-December 1993. And the only reason I caved and stood on the edge of Maroon Lake, which I said I had never done before and would never do, was because there was nobody there except for NBC Nightly News. That year, I had published a book at the behest of then Colorado Senator Tim Wirth, where for the previous 18 months, I'd photographed 750,000 acres of prospective new wilderness to be added to the National Wilderness Preservation System in Colorado. And the 2 years before, Tim and his wife Ren had beseeched me to do that on my own volition. And because they felt that they would have a lot better chance convincing the Senate and the House in Washington, D.C. to pass a new wilderness bill if they had more than just map boundaries. So they wanted images. And I did that for a year and a half. And we published a little book called Colorado, Our Wilderness Future. And sure enough, after passing those copies out to the several hundred members of the Senate and the House, the bill passed. And so at the end of 1993, Roger O'Neill, the NBC News correspondent in Colorado, hired some snowmobiles from the T Lazy 7 Ranch, and we went up with the film crew to Maroon Lake. And I took this photo right before the interview. I was actually standing next to my camera and tripod with my arm up on the camera prop like that, and they were about to interview me about the project, and I looked around and I saw the snow blowing off Maroon Peak on the left, and the mist starting to, come off of the partially frozen lake. And I said, interview suspended, turned around, got this in the black and white photo, and then we did the interview. And then that night, I was on NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw in front of, I think back in those days, it was about 15 million people. This is another photograph of Maroon Peak. Those of you who've hiked and climbed in the Maroon Bell Snowmass Wilderness know that's the view of the west face of Maroon Peak from Frigidaire Pass, which I've slept on top of many times, but not in the last 15 years because way too many people go there anymore. And then this is another shot looking back at the bells going up towards Willow Pass. So I've just passed the turnoff to Buckskin Pass, which drops down into Snowmass Creek, and I'm heading up to Willow Lakes, another of my favorite places on Earth. And put the, looks like Sky Pilots in the foreground, the red sandstone in the middle ground, and the bells in the background. So here's some of that artwork that William Henry Holmes did. This is just kind of a quickie sketch, I think, that he did. You can see that he labeled it Maroon Mountain, as Jeri said. That's what they called the whole massif back in those days. And looks like the angle is, I'm betting that's from the west too, with Maroon Peak on the left and North Maroon on the right. So here's one of the pairs of photos from the Jackson Fielder project from the Colorado 1870 to 2000 book. William Henry Jackson was on what they didn't have a name for in those days, but today we call it Trail Rider Pass, part of the four pass loop that you all know well. So we're looking off towards the bells on the left, and Jackson stood by those rocks. And whenever in that project, I had a tough time finding his location, which usually was just naked eye triangulation, trying to get things to line up with each other in the distance the same way it appeared in Jackson's photos. But if there were rocks in the foreground, like watch this, that were still there, I knew exactly where to plant my tripod to make his same photo all over again. In this case, 125 years later. So Jeri's gonna talk a little bit about the naming of Castle and Conundrum. This is a photograph of Castle. That is not sunrise light, that is twilight. There's a difference between alpenglow and direct light. Alpenglow is before any of the direct sun, the orange light on a clear day. In other words, before it hits the peaks. So it's simply the reflection of the colors in the atmosphere before sunrise. Depending on how much particulate matter, that can be very warm like this. And it actually makes Castle Peak look like it's getting direct light. So I'm on a tripod. This is about a 6-second exposure. And that's the moon seen through diffuse clouds setting behind not only Castle Peak, but that's Conundrum Peak, directly below the moon. And this is one of the many photos that I've made over the years from one of my favorite single, definitely favorite hut system, the Braun hut system, but one of my favorite huts, the Green Wilson hut, which is right next to the Taggart hut. And I always get up in the dark and ski up to Pearl Basin or up above the hut itself or up to Castle Peak and stand on a ridge with my tripod and camera. In this case, it was Pentax medium format 6x7 film camera to be there, not just for sunrise, but twilight in case this kind of scene offers itself up to me. So I think Jeri's got some stories about Castle and Conundrum.
Do. Castle Peak, the highest peak in the Elk Range and 9th highest in the state, lies at the southern end near the town of Ashcroft. It was first climbed and named by members of the Hayden Survey in the summer of 1873. However, after a grueling ascent, which Gannett said, afforded more of a climb than any other Colorado mountain with which I have had any acquaintance. They were enveloped in storm clouds on the top and could only obtain a few glimpses of the surrounding country. William Newton Byers, the editor of the Rocky Mountain News, often accompanied the Hayden expedition and would report the travels in the newspaper. He accompanied Gannett and the men on the climb up Castle Peak and describes the geology of the mountain, which suggested the name. The red beds previously mentioned have entirely disappeared from its summit. It is an elongated crest from north to south. The elements have worn the upper 1,000 feet into a row of rounded columns that look like turrets, rising from the ends and each ascending one higher than the last to the center. At top, they are serrated and in profile look like a line of knobs, but lower down, they are joined together at the opposite sides. It was named Castle Mountain and is considerably more than 14,000 feet high. Less than a half mile north of Castle Peak lies Conundrum Peak. And since it was long considered a subsummit, neither the Hayden nor Wheeler surveys gave it a name nor attempted to climb it. While upon the summit of Castle Peak, they were afforded very few glimpses of the surrounding country due to being enveloped in storm clouds, and what they did manage to see was very unsatisfactory. They most likely didn't see the great peak to the north, the peak almost as lofty as the one upon which they were standing. The name for this peak comes from the creek and hot springs of the same name at the base of Castle Peak. The word conundrum denotes a paradoxical, insoluble, or difficult problem. The story goes that prospectors originally named the creek after finding traces of gold in it, but when they followed it upstream and searched for the mother lode, they were in a conundrum as to the location of the gold source. In this respect, Conundrum Peak is a somewhat distant cousin of Quandary Peak, whose name denotes a state of doubt or perplexity. Quandary was also named by miners who were stumped by the identity of a mineral specimen found on its slopes. John?
Fascinating. Actually, you know, come to think of it, this was not from the Green Wilson hut. This was on a trip to the Lindley hut. And we climbed up on a ridge before sunrise to get that image. So that's also in the Ron hut system. But this photo definitely was 2 years ago. We skied up from the hut, which is down in the lower right in the drainage. You can't see it. So you can see my ski tracks zigzagging up into Pearl Basin, which whenever, like I said, I go to Green Wilson hut, I'll get up in the dark and get up there and make sure I'm there by sunrise. But that's actually sunrise. You can see the direct light on the Castle Massif. Conundrum's off in the background. And that shows the whole drainage. This is a stitched panoramic. So it's maybe, I think, 6 photos with my Lumix point and shoot, but it's a pretty sophisticated point and shoot. It's called a ZS100 and it has 20 megapixels. It's raw capture. And, you know, almost as good as the SLR. And the SLR is a lot harder to carry up to elevations like this. So I love taking the Lumix. But it's a stitched panoramic. It's probably 15,000 pixels across, and it shows the whole basin from left to right of, you know, the drainage that the Pearl Pass Road goes up. And then over Pearl Pass, you drop down into the Friends Hut on the other side of the ridge. There's Castle again in the background, but this is from the Crested Butte area. So we're looking at it from the south. And wait till you see this. You know, in that project, the repeat photography project, not only did I try to get the same location, I tried to get it at the right time of year. So there's another 1873 photo during the Hayden survey that Jackson took. And he's standing near Coffee Pot Pass. So again, that's one of the ways you get out of the Conundrum Creek drainage and go south over Coffee Pot Pass and drop into the Brush Creek drainages, which drain down to Crested Butte. So he's up on that ridge looking kind of northwest to Castle. You can see it on the far left. And I found this location in 1998, exactly. Watch this. When I fade from then to now. Look how perfectly it's aligned and how there's a little bit more snow, but those same snowfields still exist. So next is Capitol Peak, and Jeri's got some cool information about how that got named.
So first, before I talk about Capitol, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Elk Mountains and sort of the background on that naming. It was named for the large herds of elk that still roam in the area. The name the Elk Mountains was not the first choice. While the Hayden Survey was working in this range during the summer of 1873, their original plan was to call this mountain range the National Mountains and name peaks after government departments. The name of Capitol Peak was consistent with this government department theme, as was Treasury Mountain and White House Peak, which was the original name for SNOWMASS Mountain. Ultimately, however, the long history of local pioneers calling them the Elk Mountains took precedence. As a geologist, Ferdinand Hayden was fascinated with the structure of the Elk Range, describing it as a region in which the rocks have been thrown into a greater state of chaos than we have observed anywhere in the West. Chief topographer with the Hayden Survey, Henry Gannett, offered his opinion of this range when he stated, "The broad, massive ridges of the Sawatch Range give way to sharp conical peaks, ragged serrated ridges, pinnacles, and spires. The mountains present a great diversity of colors, with some being light gray, others red, maroon, and brown sandstone," and asserts that the Elk Mountain Group is one of the most remarkable ranges in our Western territories, and so far as my own explorations have extended, is unique in form and structure. Very little was known about the range and its mountains until the Hayden surveys of 1873 and 74, and the Wheeler survey of 1874. Gannett was quoted in the Hayden survey's 1874 report as saying, "With the exception of a little work done along the borders, this country was as little known as any part of the Western territories. No map representing even the most general features was in existence. Hayden's men named the 714ers in this range and were the first to summit 2 of them." As with most other ranges in Colorado, mining played an important role in the history of the Elk Mountains. However, due to the ruggedness of the terrain, its previous metals were some of the last to be discovered in the state, and it wasn't until 1879 that silver was discovered in Aspen by prospectors who had migrated from Leadville. And now a little story about Capitol Peak. As mentioned previously.
By the way, excuse me, Jeri, that's Capitol Peak on the right, not on the left. This is from Pierre Lake's basin. I'll talk about that when Jeri's done with the story.
Okay. As mentioned previously, the name of Capitol Peak was one of the original names selected when the Hayden Survey considered the idea of naming the range the National Range. The name was chosen because of the mountain's resemblance from certain directions to the dome of the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. Although Hayden and his men had entertained the idea of a government-themed mountain range when they first sighted this peak from the east, it looked like a slender but perfectly shaped pyramid, and they designated it Black Pyramid. However, when viewed from the south or north, it takes on an altogether more stately appearance, like that of a grand dome, and thus the name of Capitol. Early prospectors called SNOWMASS Mountain and Capitol Peak the twins, most likely for their proximity rather than their appearance. Hayden's chief topographer, Henry Gannett, describes Capitol Mountain as one of the crowning summits of the range, whose gray prism-shaped top and precipitous sides forbid access. A.C. Peel, geologist with the survey, notes that beyond and reaching above, bathed in sunlight, stood the Capitol and SNOWMASS Mountains, their immense snowfields glistening with silver brilliancy. Members of the Hayden Survey didn't attempt to summit this intimidating mountain. In fact, the first ascent wasn't until 35 years later when Percy Hagerman and Harold Clark scaled it on August 22nd, 1908, 3 days before their first ascent of Maroon Peak North. After 4 summers of climbing the Elk Mountains, Hagerman concluded that Capitol Peak was the most interesting of all his climbs. In his notes on mountaineering in the Elk Mountains of Colorado, Hagerman stated that, as far as we can learn, no other party has ever been on Capitol Peak. There was no evidence on the summit of any previous ascent, and the peak was reputed to be unclimbable by the ranchmen living in the neighborhood.
Thank you, Jeri. So for those of you that are not familiar with Pierre Lakes, it's relatively difficult to get to. It drains down into Snowmass Creek when you're hiking up Snowmass Creek towards Snowmass Lake. So just kind of on the other side of Snowmass Lake. And as I mentioned, on the right is Capitol at sunrise. But for those of you who've explored the Maroon Bell Snowmass Wilderness, and especially you photographers, you know, Capitol has that amazing shape from all directions and is incredibly photogenic. I mean, as popular as the Maroon Bells are to photograph, you know, that can be a cliche from the lake, but if you explore the wilderness, you can see Capitol from just about every direction. That's another twilight photo using the silhouette of the ridge that contains Capitol on the left to define the bottom of the photo. This is from Avalanche Pass, which is over by Marble, Colorado. So we're looking east towards Capitol on the left. I mean, look how prominent that is. And look at all of the couloirs that come off of the granite. I mean, it's like you know, from Aspen to Crested Butte, or all those batholiths that are, you know, uplifted granite swells, and all the other sedimentary and metamorphic rocks have weathered away. And it's an incredibly erosive rock to give it that character with all of those lines. Another photograph of Capitol from the west. And then, of course, Capitol Lake provides a completely different perspective of the peak itself. And the flowers, you all know, they're always glorious. On the left, rosy paintbrush. On the right, state flower, Colorado columbine, from right next to the lake. There's another W.H. Holmes sketch. You can see at the very top left of the image his penmanship, Capitol Peak and Snowmass Mountain to the left of it, and Pyramid Peak to the left of it. And another of my favorites, with the biggest snowfield that lasts the longest typically in Colorado, and Jeri's going to talk about that now.
Okay, thanks. Located between Capitol Peak and Maroon Bells, this peak was given several names before one was actually decided upon. In an 1873 article for the American Journal of Science and Arts, Ferdinand Hayden explains one of these names. 3 miles further south of Capitol Peak is another great peak, only about 50 feet lower, which we call the White House, from the conspicuous snowfield about a mile in horizontal breadth and having a slope of half a mile, which covers its eastern front. This snowmass is by far the largest we have found in the mountains of Colorado, and distinctly marks and characterizes the peak, even as seen from the Front Range 80 miles away. This name was in keeping with the original idea to christen the Elk Mountains the National Mountains. The survey's topographer, Henry Gannett, refers to the peak by a different name in his 1874 survey report. 2 3/10 miles farther south of Capitol Peak on the main ridge is a summit which has been named Snowmass Mount. This also is one of the highest summits in the system, being slightly inferior to Capitol Mountain in elevation. It has received its name from the immense field of snow on its eastern face. The snowfield in August, which is the month when there is the least snow in the mountains, has an area of fully 5 square miles. Probably this is the nearest approach to a glacier in the Rocky Mountains. William Newton Byers, editor of the Rocky Mountain News, often accompanied the Hayden expedition in Colorado and wrote in his newspaper about his adventures. His August 17, 1873 article suggests another name for the mountain. We broke camp this morning and started for the great central peak of the range, the extreme western object of our present ambition. Later, it was given the name White Bison, and later still White House. What will be the final decision is now uncertain, but we incline to the name first proposed, Snowmass. because it is the only mountain we have that is uniformly white all year upon one face. Byers continues to ruminate on the name of the peak and the range in general in his article a few days later when he says, "The name White House has been settled upon in honor of the home of the president. Another lofty peak nearby is to be named Capitol. Some of its silver-ribbed neighbors will doubtless be named Treasury, and then will follow Cabinet, Post Office, etc. In fact, before we left the Sawatch Range, a proposition to call this wonderful group of cloud-piercing peaks the National Mountains was seriously entertained and discussed. Had that been done, the plan would have been to represent each department in the national government by a like name to as many of the loftiest summits." Hayden, prior to considering that the Elk Mountains be named the National Mountains, had entertained the idea of calling the Sawatch Range the National Range. Neither suggestion stuck due to the fact that the local people already had established names for these ranges. The survey eventually decided upon the name SNOWMASS as the best name for this peak, and it was hyphenated at that time. On August 7th, Byers accompanied the surveymen on the first official ascent of SNOWMASS, and it was also the first recorded ascent of any 14er in the Elk Mountains. Byers entertains his reader with some of the details of the climb. The climb was made in from 2 to 3 hours by different members of the party. On the summit, we found the scientific men who had been there 3 to 4.5 hours making the ascent. They had unwisely started straight up from the west, been led into a vast amphitheater filled with broken, loose, and sliding rock, the surface partially covered with snow and ice, and rimmed above and at its sides by vertical cliffs. Mr. Gardner, the geographer with the survey, had pronounced it the most difficult and dangerous climb he had ever made. Several times he considered his life in great jeopardy. 3 times his attendant saved him from falling backward by planting his tripod he carried against his back. On one of the large snowbanks was a grizzly bear, and he stayed all during the day. Sometimes he was leisurely sauntering about, then rolling over in the snow. Next, he would take a lunch of grasshoppers and then sit upon his haunches and watch the party. Byers considered the view from the top well worth the climb. Considering the technical difficulty of climbing SNOWMASS Mountain, it is highly unlikely that any Aspen area prospectors had summited it before Hayden and his men did. And that's
Imagine that.
SNOWMASS.
Grizzly bears.
I like the grizzly bear story.
And, the part about finding a name ultimately for the peak that would last, we think today that it's polemical and political and complicated about Mount Evans and how to rename that and what's right and what's wrong, and a number of other naming issues in Colorado and around America today. But what you just said reminds us that really times don't change that much. It was quite an issue to pin a name on that mountain.
Yeah.
So this photo was made from Buckskin Pass, looking at SNOWMASS. If you look closely on the right, you can see SNOWMASS Lake down in that cirque. Those flowers are sulfur paintbrush, or we also call them yellow paintbrush. So Capitol Peak and Pierre Lakes would be off to the right in between the 2 successive ridges. As I mentioned, Bob Wogren, who did the oil paintings for the, or provided them for the project, also did pencil sketches and pen sketches before he ever did the paintings. And this is his pencil sketch of SNOWMASS Mountain. And there's a pencil sketch done in 1873 by Mr. Holmes. You can see Sopris on the far left, Daly, Capitol, SNOWMASS, Maroon, and Treasury Mountain on the right. So lo and behold, here's William Henry Jackson, the official photographer's photo of White House Mountain. So look in the bottom left-hand corner. I hope you can see it on your computers. That's Jackson's caption, just like Jeri said. SNOWMASS Mountain, which is the mountain on the far left, was called White House Mountain for a while. And actually, I hope you explorers recognize that lake. It's not called Elk Lake today. It was called Elk Lake then. But before I go to the now photo, do you see that rock in the bottom left-hand corner? I estimate, based on scale, that that rock probably weighs 500, 600, 700 pounds. So 120 5 years later, when I got to this same location at, of course, Geneva Lake, and now it's called Snowmass Mountain on the left, where is the rock? This was one of the great mysteries of the 300 repeat photo project, was what happened to that rock? Believe it or not, it bugged me so much that I actually stripped down to my skivvies and went into the lake and looked for it in the bottom of the lake, and there was no rock. So where the heck is that rock? If any of you know where that rock is, please solve that dilemma in my life. But I've rationalized that because I'm somewhat metaphysical, that it was probably aliens, that they wanted that rock for some reason, and it was beamed up at one point in time. So Jeri's gonna conclude us with Pyramid Peak, and that is Pyramid, and same vantage going up towards Willow Pass from Maroon Lake with Rosy Paintbrush in the foreground and Pyramid in the very middle in the background. Take it away, Jeri.
Thanks, John. East of the Maroon Bells and southwest of Aspen sits the imposing Pyramid Peak. Henry Gannett, topographer with the 1874 Hayden Survey, details the geography surrounding this peak and the reason for its name. The main ridge from Maroon Mountain turns west for a few miles, and with two quite high summits on it in this part of its course, then turns south and suddenly falls considerably at the head of Maroon Creek, sending off a heavy spur separating the two branches of Maroon Creek. The highest point of this spur is near its end, and it has been named Pyramid Peak from its peculiar shape. It is a first-class peak reaching nearly 14,000 feet. With fascinating, if not severe, geological characteristics, the Elk Mountains were a focus of the Hayden Survey in 1873 and 74. Although several survey parties had been near this range in previous years, none had produced an accurate assessment or even a map of the area. As was often the problem with different expeditions operating and often competing in rivalry at the same time, maps weren't always in agreement. This was the case in 1873 with the Hayden's mapping surveys, led by Gannett, conflicting with those of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The problem first came to light in a letter from Lieutenant Ernest Ruffner of the Corps to Hayden, in which he protests Hayden's ignoring the Army explorations and renaming prominent landmarks already named by his party. Gannett addresses these accusations in the 1874 Hayden Survey report when he says, Ruffner's map, of which this area forms but a small portion, was published in the spring of 1874. And Mr. Prout, and Prout was the civilian director of Ruffner's expedition, which accompanies the maps, he gives certain names to some of the prominent mountain peaks in this area. These names would be placed on our maps were it possible to identify the peaks on which they had been bestowed, but neither from his report nor from his map can the names be located. Until the Hayden Survey, many of the expeditions were little more than reconnaissance missions intended only to approximate the positions of specific geographical points in order to create a map of the interior. Hayden's men determined that the top of Pyramid Peak, like Capitol and Maroon Bells, was inaccessible. It wouldn't be until August 31st, 1908, when the first official ascent was recorded by Percy Hagerman and Harold Clark. To guide them in what was relatively unknown territory, the duo relied on Hayden's maps from 1873 and 1874, which proved for the most part to be completely accurate. In his notes on mountaineering in the Elk Mountains of Colorado, Hagerman describes the technicality of Pyramid Peak's ascent. At 12,000 feet on the west face, there followed a series of almost horizontal rock shelves connected by very narrow chimneys, which are not hard to climb, but which sometimes give rise in feelings of instability when they drop into nothingness. The climb is an intensely interesting one. Once on top, they found no evidence of any previous visits, and their names were on record as being the first official ascent of the Grand Peak. And that's
Egerman was quite the climber. Thank goodness a peak got named for
yeah.
that man. And there's another Wogren sketch of Pyramid Peak. Fantastic. Here's a couple of other, just for fun, um, pieces of art that we found in our research. Uh, this is a Thomas Moran um, pen and ink of Italian Mountain. I don't know how many of you know Italian Mountain, but it's on the south end of the Maroon Bell Snowmass Wilderness, closer to Crested Butte. But I just love the scale with the climbers and the precipitousness of his rendering. And another southern, as we call it, Maroon Bell Snowmass Wilderness depiction today with Teocalli Mountain just outside Crested Butte on the left. And a twin lake shot on the other side of the mountain range off Highway 82. I just love William Henry Holmes's depiction of that side of the mountain range. So unfortunately, we've had so much fun talking about the Elk Mountains today. There won't be time to show you, to tempt you with some San Juan mountain photos to for sure buy the book. But next Monday night, December 7th, we're going to do the generic slideshow that includes all of the mountain ranges, the 8 mountain ranges that are in the book that contain the 14ers for the Steamboat Library, the Buddy Werner Library. So go to johnfielder.com, click on events, and you can sign up for the Steamboat Library Zoom show if you'd like to see the rest of the state. And then also when you go to johnfielder.com, you can purchase the book there. We ship it from our facility in Aurora, and you'll get it in just a few days via USPS media mail. Still time to get it before Christmas if you act now. But of course, check Explore booksellers first in Aspen and buy it from them. And if for whatever reason you can't get it from Explore, then go to my website and get it there. So thank you so much, Charlie. Thanks to the Pitkin County Library System for inviting us tonight. Thank you, Jeri, for doing this. And if it's okay with Charlie, we're happy to stick around and answer some questions if there are any questions.
Absolutely. So if anyone wanted to type questions into the Q&A or the chat feature, we'd be happy to accept those. And then a side note, Explore does have the books I actually ordered 2 today for Christmas presents. So definitely contact Explore and they will get them to you.
I want to hear from somebody who's been to Pierre Lakes. Come on, give it up.
Oop. You see, Martha, I hear you, or I see your hand. Here, I'm going to allow you to talk and you can ask a question. Martha, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, this is Martha. She is one of my colleagues at Pitkin County Library. So take it away, Martha.
Hi, Martha.
Hello. Hi, Jeri. What a wonderful thing you've done for us. I did just say, you know, many of us are from the flatlands. Even if we've been here decades, we are still from the flatlands, and we come here and don't know how to orient ourselves with these. We just with the mountains, and they're just so impressive and gorgeous. But a presentation like this really does help to give us even more appreciation for the history and the passions of the people who explored this and help document it. So thank you for bringing it to us. And then my real question is, Where the heck is Pierre Lakes?
If you, thanks, Martha. If you, and thanks for the compliment for Jeri. Yeah, it's 3 years of hard labor digging up all this information and making it presentable. If you hike up Snowmass Creek from the Snowmass Creek Lake trailhead, before you get to Snowmass Lake, it's the drainage on the right. But when I did it
Oh.
back in the 80s and 90s, there is a trail, but I don't think it's an official trail. It may be, but it's a steep scramble through meadows. And then all of a sudden you find yourself in what is the largest cirque, glacial scoured basin of nothing but talus in the whole state. The only thing that compares to it is the boulder field below Long's Peak on the classic trail to the top of Long's Peak, where it's, the boulder fields maybe a 3/4 of a mile by 3/4 of a mile of 1 billion talus boulders. But Pierre Lakes Basin with 3 big lakes and some ponds is even larger, maybe a mile by a mile. And there is no tundra. That once you get to the top of the cirque, there's some dwarf spruce fir trees there and grass. And then after that, it is solid talus all the way up to the crest of the range.
Oh, wow. Daunting. Thank you.
We have a few questions coming in. Thank you, Martha. Annie wants to know which story stands out most to either of you from all the peaks.
Well, my favorite story is Mount Massive because that name survived 3 name change attempts. And it's such a boring name, Massive Mountain. But the people of Leadville and Lake County, it's their mountain. They consider it theirs and nobody's going to mess with the name. And so that story is my favorite, of how everybody rallied to get the name saved.
And when was that, Jeri?
The first attempt was at the turn of the century in the early 1900s. Then there was one in 1922, and then there was one as late as 1965.
Do you know, in each of those times, were they wanting to change it to different names, or was there like kind of one competing name that whole time?
No, they wanted to, after President McKinley had died, they wanted to change it to that and get rid of Massive and name it after him. But there was such an outrage with a letter writing campaign and articles in the newspaper and everything that was dropped. And then the next one was Henry Gannett that I had spoken about with the Hayden survey. He did so much for understanding topography and everything like that. And he had recently passed away. So someone proposed that his name be there because he was the one that named it. So, but still there was outrage, and again, they won and Massive stood. And then in 1965, a young senator from Denver wanted to rename it Mount Sir Winston Churchill. That would have been a nameful, because Churchill had just died. And even though he had absolutely no ties to the state or the mountains, and that was a short-lived win again. So hopefully the name is here to stay.
Yeah, we'll see. John, how about you?
Challenger Peak is in the Sangre de Cristos, and I think, Jeri, is that the most recent name
Yes.
given to a volcano?
Yeah.
Challenger is next to Kit Carson Peak and not far from Creston Peak and Needle and North Colony. Is it North Colony or Humboldt?
Humboldt.
Yeah, Humboldt. So, it was dedicated in memory of the astronauts who were lost in the Challenger shuttle crash. So that's my current one that I think about most.
Interesting. I did not know that at all. Okay, we do have another question from, I believe it's the same Eleanor Bennett, our friend over at Aspen Public Radio. She has 2 questions. First, Jeri, what made you want to research the names of these peaks, and what did they mean to you?
What first got me going was I heard a snippet that said Mount Evans used to be named Mount Rosalie. And I was just so intrigued because first of all, it's a woman's name and no 14ers have a woman's name on it. And really, if it was named after a woman, how did that come about? And then how did she get demoted? How did she lose her name? So that's what started me on the whole thing. And I was just doing it to satisfy curiosity. And the more I started exploring all the other names, it was a couple years into it and I realized that this had never really been documented and it would be a good thing to do in a book.
Great. And the second part of her question was, does the book also feature or talk about the indigenous names of different mountains?
It does, as far as I could find them. What happens is when I talk about first ascents and first official recorded ascents, those are with the expeditions and the people that were actually making maps and doing stuff like that. So they were actually writing these things down. But the indigenous people in their daily lives, you know, may have gone up and over these peaks just in the course of their daily lives. And nothing was really recorded. Oliver Toll did go with a lot of the Arapaho Indians in, I think it was 1918, in Estes Park and wrote down their words for things and their names for things. But other than that, unless it was common knowledge, it's really hard to find.
Yeah, I bet.
But there is really good text that Jeri wrote about the peaks that are named after Native Americans like Chavano and Tabawatch and
Yeah.
Uncompahgre was a Ute name. So there's quite a bit of good text about how they came by those names.
Jeri, what are some of your other books?
This is it. This is my first one.
Great.
I've written lots of papers, but this is my first book.
Where might we be able to find some of your papers?
They are archived at in the Western History section of the Denver Public Library, which unfortunately has been closed and still is closed. And I don't know, unless you actually go there, I don't know if a research librarian will research it for you. They may, I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, that's one of my favorite places to go in Denver is that floor of the Denver Public Library.
That's where I did so much research and they were just amazing. They have so much there. So yeah, that's where my papers are.
Great. Well, I can always contact someone there and look into that. Let me see if there's any other questions. Oh, Eleanor, follow up. She wants to know if you know what happened to Rosalie.
I do. She, oh yes. That's another one of my favorite stories. Quick story. She, Albert Bierstadt, the renowned artist, came to Colorado, traveled to Colorado with a man named Fitzhugh Ludlow. And Bierstadt wanted to do sketches from which to make a great Rocky Mountain picture. He had done a couple famous pictures in Wyoming and he wanted to do one of the Colorado Rockies. So they came here and William Newton Byers, who I spoke of, was his guide. And they went up Chicago Creek and they ended up on the top of what is Mount Evans, and it didn't have a name. And Bierstadt named it in honor of his traveling companion's wife, Rosalie. So Rosalie was married to Fitzhugh Ludlow, and Bierstadt named the peak Rosalie Peak, or Mount Rosalie, which was a harbinger of things to come because 3 years later, she divorced Ludlow and married Bierstadt, and his famous painting, Storm in the Rocky Mountains, Mount Rosalie, debuted to wide acclaim, and they were happily married, but she died early on from tuberculosis. So she died in her 50s, but they were very happily married.
Wow, that's an incredible story. It's like the Layla of...
Yes, exactly. The Layla, yeah. She was the Layla of Eric Clapton.
How funny.
Yeah.
Great. Well, any other questions out there? We have lots of thank yous from people who were able to attend. So thank you so much to everyone who made time in their Thursday evening to join us. Again, John and Jeri's book is available at Explore Booksellers. It's also available online at johnfielder.com. We have a copy on order for the library, and I know a few other libraries in our Marmot library system have it as well. So no excuses not to check it out. Well, thank you, John and Jeri, so much for joining us. We appreciate your time, and good luck with the book and the rest of your engagements.
Thank you, Charlie, and thank you everyone that attended.
Thank you, Pitkin County. See you on the slopes.
Bye. Take care. Thank you.
Bye.